So this talk is based on one of my books, came out last year, 2015, called Is the Atheist My Neighbor? And it comes out of really my own experiences for the last 10 years of interacting with atheists, both in the online blog community and public debates, having friends who are atheists, and also in the academic community. So it has been 10 years since evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins published his most popular book, a book that, ironically enough, had nothing to do with evolution or biology. With The God Delusion, Dawkins cemented his status as the world's preeminent atheist. Unfortunately, this ambassador for atheism chose the methods of hard diplomacy, as he mercilessly lampooned the alleged ignorance, irrationality, and intolerance of what he termed the faith heads of religion. Nor was Dawkins the only atheist to adopt this new hard diplomacy, which has come to be known as the New Atheism. Several high-profile new atheists have reflected a similar style, including Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and the late Christopher Hitchens. This withering view of religion generally, and of Christianity in particular, is also widespread among lay members of the skeptic atheist community, who often dismiss Christianity as irrational and immoral. Often within this context, belief in God is likened to belief in an imaginary friend, Santa Claus, leprechauns, invisible pink unicorns, or flying spaghetti monsters. And Christian doctrine is mocked. That was my introductory title. It is mocked as in this graphic I got from an atheist website. God sacrificed himself to appease himself, and therefore save humanity from himself. Makes sense. Obviously sarcastic here. Well, from the perspective of the academic theologian, this alleged summary of Christian doctrine is little more than a straw man caricature of the doctrines of Trinity, incarnation, and atonement. But it reflects a widespread sentiment within the skeptic atheist community that Christian doctrine is patently ridiculous. There is much to lament and critique in this skeptic atheist denunciation of Christian quote-unquote faith heads, and countless Christian theologians and apologists have done so. Perhaps more notably, many atheists have also critiqued this new atheism. Among them, Michael Roos, J.L. Schellenberg, Thomas Nagel, Ronald Dworkin, Jeffrey Lauder, and Massimo Pigliucci. So Pigliucci, for example, gained notoriety in the last year with an incisive essay titled Reflections on the Skeptic and Atheist Movements. In that bold essay, Pigliucci critiques what he identifies as widespread problems within the skeptic atheist community, including nastiness in decorum, a focus on celebrity culture, groupthink, and anti-intellectualism. So sort of ironic charges for a community that often identifies itself as rationalist free thinkers. But my interest here is not on how atheists view Christians. Rather, I'm interested in how Christians view atheists. And the sad truth is that Christians, on the whole, are really no better behaved than many of these new atheists. If new atheists often caricature Christian beliefs, Christians are all too quick to return the favor, as in this graphic from a Christian website. Atheism, the belief that there was nothing and nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything. And then a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason whatsoever into self-replicating bits, which then turned into dinosaurs. Makes perfect sense. Notice how each of these groups is pretty much in a mirror way caricaturing the beliefs of the other belief community. But it isn't just caricature. Christian hostility toward atheists runs very deep. Consider the case of John Hagee, head pastor of Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, Texas, a church which boasts 20,000 people in weekly attendance. As an author, Hagee's books have been featured on the New York Times bestseller list. As a spokesperson for conservative evangelicals, he's been featured on channels like CNN, as well as on his own television program on the Daystar Network. In short, Hagee is a leading representative of mainstream conservative evangelical Christianity. And here's how he addresses atheism in a recent sermon. So if you could, Bill, if you could just push the start button.
They're saying that the Ten Commandments have been taken out of the courtrooms and out of the schoolhouses, lest we offend the atheists. Let me be very clear. This country was not built for atheists nor by atheists. It was built by Christian people who believed in the Word of God. To the atheist watching this telecast, if our belief in God offends you, move. There are planes leaving every hour, on the hour, going every place on planet Earth. Get on one. We don't want you, and we won't miss you. I promise you. Our coins say, "In God we trust." President Obama, you recently told the foreign media that America is not a Christian nation. You're absolutely wrong. We were, we are, and always shall be a Bible-reading, praying Christian people. Several years ago, witchcraft and Satanism were officially approved by the U.S. military at the direction of the U.S. Congress. We have officially chosen to recognize another God. I call upon the members of Congress to outlaw the practice of witchcraft and Satanism in the U.S. military, lest we offend the God of heaven. I don't care about the atheist.
Well, I'll tell you this, if I could deliver my lecture with that kind of rhetorical panache, this would be a lot more interesting, wouldn't it? Here we see what it strikes me as a rather shocking display, but it is a glimpse behind the veil of a widespread and deep-seated Christian hostility toward atheists. Given that Christians are called to turn the other cheek, to love our enemy, what explains this fire-breathing anger of John Hagee and his enthusiastic congregants? Is it born of offense and alienation brought about by new atheist rhetoric? Perhaps a fear and misunderstanding of people in a targeted outgroup? Or maybe it's a sense of threat and cultural marginalization resulting from the perception that America is increasingly secular and hostile to faith. While each of those issues surely deserves its own treatment, in this talk I want to address another catalyst for this hostility, one that is born of theological assumptions about the genesis and nature of atheism itself. It's a perspective that I believe is widespread in the Christian community and which I believe to be unjustified and indeed prejudicial. So what is it? Well, I call it the rebellion thesis, or henceforth RT, and for the purpose of our discussion, I'll define it like this. While atheists profess to believe that God does not exist, this disbelief is the result of an active and culpable suppression of an innate disposition to believe in God, which is born of a hatred of God and a desire to sin with impunity. Well, we can illustrate the claim of RT as follows. Imagine that you get into a dispute with Jones about the color of your boss's car. You say it is white, while Jones insists that it is black. In order to settle this issue, you go out to the parking lot to look at the car. Sure enough, the car is white. Anybody can see it. It's just plain before your eyes. See, you say, the car is white. But incredibly, Jones stubbornly shakes his head and retorts, no it isn't, it's black, just like I said. Assuming that Jones is not delusional, you would likely conclude that his insistence that the car is black was a disingenuous refusal to admit that which he really does know. That any honest person looking at the evidence can just see that the car is white. Similarly, according to RT Rebellion Thesis, any reasonable, non-delusional person looking at the world can just see that God exists. Consequently, the refusal to concede God's existence, like the refusal to admit that the boss's car is white, would be born of a disingenuous refusal to acknowledge that which one really does know. Moreover, the reason one refuses to acknowledge God's existence is because of hostility, because one is against God. In short, RT entails that all instances of atheism are at their core instances of anti-theism, of sinful, incendiary rebellion against the creator and sustainer of the universe. By contrast, the Christian believes that since God is maximally good, loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, it is both irrational and wicked to be against God in this way. Thus, if the Christian adopts RT, if she interprets all instances of atheism as this rebellion, she is thereby committed to viewing the atheist's unbelief as irrational and wicked, a denial of a natural knowledge of God. If this is the assumption, it's no surprise that Christians are thereby hostile toward and suspicious of atheists. After all, they are in open rebellion against all that is good and true. So how should we analyze RT? In the time that remains, I'm going to proceed in 4 steps. We will begin with a key question. Do Christians, in fact, hold this bleak view of atheism? Well, perhaps some don't, but I'm going to argue that many do. While I do not have any survey data on the percentages, it does seem to me these sentiments are widely held. And in support of that claim, I will list 3 high-profile examples of Christians analyzing atheism in the terms of RT. I take it this will be sufficient to illustrate that RT is a common contemporary Christian interpretation of atheism, and that will be sufficient for my purposes. From there, we can turn to assessing the evidence for RT. That evidence comes in 2 forms: biblical texts that allegedly teach RT, and empirical evidence that atheists behave in a manner conforming to or anticipated by RT. I will critique both of these lines of evidence before drawing my conclusions in the final section. So first, part 1, evidence that Christians hold RT. In his entry on atheism in the influential 1967 Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Paul Edwards includes a subsection titled Hostility to Atheism, where he observes, quote, "One could fill many volumes with the abuse and calumny contained in the writings of Christian apologists, learned no less than popular. The tenor of these writings is not simply that atheism is mistaken, but also that only a depraved person could adopt a position so hideous." While one could consider many historical instances of Christians taking this analysis of atheism, and in my book I spend a chapter going through some historical examples, for the sake of time here, I'm simply going to list 3 contemporary examples. We can begin with the case of R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul is a prolific Christian theologian and apologist who has written dozens of books and hosts a popular syndicated radio show called Renewing Your Mind. In one of his books, Sproul describes the following interaction he had with a group of atheists on a university campus, much like this one. He says, "I was invited to a university campus several years ago to speak to an atheists club. They asked me to present the intellectual case for the existence of God. I did. And as I went through the arguments for the existence of God, I kept things on an intellectual plane. All things were safe and comfortable until I got to the end of my lecture. At that point, I said, I'm giving arguments for the existence of God, but I feel like I'm carrying coals to Newcastle, because I have to tell you, I do not have to prove to you that God exists, because I think that you already know it. Your problem is not that you do not know that God exists. Your problem is that you despise the God whom you know exists. Your problem is not intellectual, it is moral. You hate God. Don't you wish you were on a fly on the wall in that meeting? In this passage, we see Sproul declaring that arguments for God's existence are a moot point, for atheists already know that God exists, and their denial of this knowledge is nothing more than a sinful and rebellious refusal to submit to the knowledge they have. Like this fellow who says, no, the car is black. In Sproul's view, people describe themselves as atheists not because they disbelieve in God, but because they hate the God they do believe in. My second example comes from Christian apologist and philosopher James Spiegel. He's a professor at Taylor University in Uplands, Indiana. And in 2011, he published a book titled The Making of an Atheist: How Immorality Leads to Unbelief. As the subtitle suggests, the entire book constitutes an analysis of atheism along the lines of RT. Spiegel writes, atheism is the suppression of truth by wickedness, the cognitive consequences of immorality. In short, it is sin that is the mother of unbelief. My final example is drawn from pop culture. In particular, the 2014 film, God's Not Dead. This film was produced on a meager budget of $2 million, and yet at the box office it went on to gross over $60 million in box office receipts, mostly from conservative Christians. It has also spawned a sequel which will be released in April of this year. God's Not Dead tells the story of a young Christian named Josh Wheaton who goes off to university and has his faith tested and challenged by an atheist philosophy professor in the very first class. The professor, Dr. Radisson, hands out papers to every one of the students in the class and then demands that every one of them write "God is dead" on the piece of paper. When Josh Wheaton refuses, Dr. Radisson challenges him to a debate to prove the existence of God in front of the class. Later in the hallway, Josh meets Dr. Radisson, at which point Dr. Radisson snarls at him, "There is a God, and I'm him." Later on in the film, we learn the real source of Radisson's atheism. It's not intellectual arguments. It's the fact that his mother died when he was young, and he was so angry at God for not healing his mother that he refused to have anything more to do with God. Atheism, once again, is born of rebellion. As one Christian reviewer observes, atheists bad, Christians good. That's my 4-word summary of God's Not Dead. This anti-atheist movie would be more effective if it didn't portray every atheist as smug, angry, selfish, obnoxious, and unhappy. In contrast, nearly every Christian is kind, happy, generous. Well, you get the idea. Yes, we do. Despite the cartoonish portrayal of characters in the film, it has garnered close to 13,000 reviews on Amazon.com, averaging 4.5 stars. A lot of people love this movie. I take it that together these 3 examples are sufficient to show that sentiments like RT, such as I've described, are broadly held within the Christian community. And so we turn to our next question. What justifies the claim that every one of the hundreds of millions of atheists in the world today and throughout history were and are all sinfully suppressing their belief in God out of a hatred of God and a desire to sin with impunity? Let us first turn to what is allegedly the most important evidence for RT, that which is found in the Bible. So now we'll turn to part 2, biblical evidence for RT. In the mid-20th century, theologian Karl Barth famously declare that all Hindus are in rebellion against God. Hendrik Kramer, a missiologist, was incredulous at this sweeping judgment of people. So he asked Barth, "How many Hindus have you ever met?" The Swiss theologian replied, "None." "Then how do you know they're all in rebellion?" Kramer asked. Barth replied, "A priori." Barth's response, in other words, prior to investigation, he knows they are. He doesn't have to go out and check. Barth's response to Kramer parallels the response many Christians would give to the justification for RT. In short, they don't need to know any atheists to know that all atheists are in sinful rebellion against God. The reason is simple. Scripture teaches it. But where does Scripture teach RT? Fortunately, the list of biblical passages that are invoked in direct support for the thesis is mercifully short and consists of Psalm 14:1, Psalm 53:1, and Romans 1:18-20. Since Psalm 14 verse 1 and 53 verse 1 basically are making the same claim, we will limit our discussion here to Psalm 14:1 before we turn to Romans 1. So let's start off with Psalm 14:1. "The fool says in his heart, 'There is no God.'" This verse provides the basis for a popular bumper sticker which declares, "April 1st is Atheist Day, Psalm 14:1. Get it? Ha ha ha. This is a tough crowd. So the idea here, only fools would be atheists. It also lives on in a popular urban legend that describes an atheist going to court in search of an official holiday for atheists, only to have the judge reprimand him with the observation, "Atheists already have their own holiday, April 1st, case closed." I have heard Christians share that urban legend as if it were true. I even found it in a devotional for children or for teenagers, as if it were true. It's not. There is no doubt that Psalm 14:1 is commonly invoked in support of RT, but does it in fact support the claim? Well, the short answer is no. Now, I say more in the book, but I'm going to limit my discussion here to 2 points. 2 serious problems with this reading of the verse. To begin with, it is hopelessly anachronistic to interpret Psalm 14:1 as referring to atheism. The ancient Near East, the period in which the psalmist was writing, was a world of many gods, innumerable divine beings who had a hand in human affairs. In other words, all the denizens, all the residents of the ancient Near East were either polytheists, they believed in many gods, or they were henotheists, they believed in many gods but one supreme God. They were monolaters, they believed perhaps in many gods but worshipped one God. There were not yet strict monotheists. Certainly, there were not atheists. The categorical denial of all divine beings was an intellectual stance unknown to the ancient Hebrews. Indeed, many scholars suggest that atheism, as we currently understand it, does not appear until the 17th century AD. Consequently, it is most surely not the focus of Psalm 14:1. Now, as an aside, in the ancient world, you will find people accusing one another of being atheists. But what they mean by that is you're denying my God. So, for example, Polycarp, a bishop of Smyrna in about 155, he's standing before the Roman hordes, and he has been told you must renounce the atheists, meaning the Christians who reject the Roman gods. So he says, okay, away with the atheists, but he swings his hand at the Romans, and they get the message. The true atheists are you. So there is atheism in the ancient world, but it meant something completely different from what we think of today. So if we want to get, now this brings me to my second point, if we want to get a better sense of what the psalm is talking about, we should expand our focus beyond the first part of the first verse. So let's continue reading. "The fool says in his heart, 'There is no God.' They are corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away. All have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one." To sum up, The fool of Psalm 14:1 represents the entire human race. Interestingly, the Apostle Paul recognized the point, and so in Romans 3, part of Paul's argument opening the Epistle of Romans to argue for universal fallenness, he quotes these very verses to drive home the point. We are all fallen and alienated from God. As such, the psalmist's target is certainly not individuals who assent to the proposition God does not exist. Rather, it is the person who fails to live in accord with the moral law that God has revealed in nature and his word. And by that criterion, we're all fools. Now let's turn to our second example, Romans 1:18-20. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about them is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. In October 2015, popular Christian apologist Greg Koukl, head of Stand to Reason Ministry, released a short video in which he addresses a question based on Romans 1. It goes like this: are atheists just suppressing the truth in unrighteousness? In other words, Koukl is asking, is the rebellion thesis true? Koukl insists, yes, they are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And he then offers the following explanation. He says, what Paul says is that the evidence of God is clear to everyone, having been seen through what has been made. So you look around the world, natural revelation, general revelation, and you realize something is going on that's greater than us. And the thing that's going on is God's activity, evident to everyone. But the writer says, men characteristically suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That is, they hold down what is trying to erupt in an obvious way. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You've got to work at keeping it down. And the evidence of God is so obvious in the world, that the world exists, the way the world exists, that a person has to be denying the obvious, aggressively pushing down that evidence to turn his head the other way in order to deny the existence of God. So, Koukl describes an atheist as akin to a person struggling to hold a beach ball underwater. While that illustration complements my analogy of Jones insisting that the white car really is black, it goes further by illuminating the alleged internal struggle of the person who is attempting to persuade themselves of atheism, despite the overwhelming evidence that God stands before them. At first blush, Romans 1:18-20 seems to offer a far more promising justification for RT. But does it in fact succeed? Note first that Romans 1:18-20 does not explicitly teach RT. The text is not addressing atheists per se. Rather, as with Psalm 14, we find here a general sweeping indictment of the human race that fails to act on the knowledge available to it. The text simply does not say that every instance of a person accepting the proposition God does not exist is the result of an active, culpable suppression of natural knowledge, which is born of a hatred of God and a desire to sin. Well, that said, one might infer support for RT perhaps in Paul's words. After all, verse 20 does state that God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, like the white car, so that people are without excuse. Wouldn't that include atheists? Consequently, one could argue that people are without excuse, and thus the atheist is culpable for denying evidence of God which is clearly seen. However, note that if we read the text in this way, it is not only atheists who are morally culpable for denying the overwhelming evidence of God's existence, power, and nature. The same indictment would extend to every person who fails to accept these claims or who fails to accept them with the requisite conviction that the evidence requires. When we consider the implications of this view, I believe we will have a powerful objection, call it a reductio ad absurdum, for this RT reading of Romans 1. Think again of the car illustration. Jones is culpable if he outright denies that the car is white, but he is also culpable if he begrudgingly hedges his bets. For example, let's say Jones responds like this: well, okay, the car might be white. Perhaps it's white. I think it's white, but I have my doubts. I'm not sure. I'm really wrestling with this. While Jones is not denying that the car is white, analogous to the atheist, he is nonetheless failing to affirm that it is white in the unequivocal way that the evidence requires. He should say, yeah, it's white, clearly. Thus, he is culpable here of failing to have the appropriate conviction or response to the evidence before him. In short, the extent to which Jones fails to offer a ringing endorsement of the whiteness of the car is precisely the extent to which he is morally culpable for denying that which is obvious to every honest observer. Now, that includes the Christian, whoever finds him or herself doubting God's existence, God's power, or God's nature. If the atheist is culpable, is guilty for sinfully denying the overwhelming testimony to God's nature, or existence, or power, the Christian who doubts is equally guilty. This is a consequence with titanic implications. The fact is that millions of Christians struggle with their faith. They find their level of conviction in God's existence, power, or nature waxing and waning over time. Imagine if every diminution in the strength of one's conviction in God's existence, power, or nature were interpreted as the result of a sinful, rebellious will suppressing overwhelming evidence. To appreciate just how outrageous that would be, consider the case of Bob and Maria Giono. They were faithful Catholics for years. Then they discovered that their daughter had been repeatedly raped in their own home over a period of 7 years by the family priest, Oliver O'Grady. Do you think that Bob and Maria experienced some diminution in their level of conviction as regards God's existence, power, and or nature? Of course they did. Can you imagine analyzing that diminution in the terms provided by Greg Koukl? Can you imagine concluding that as they struggle with their belief in God's existence, power, or nature, Bob and Maria are really engaged in a disingenuous, dishonest suppression of overwhelming divine revelation akin to holding a beach ball underwater? Perhaps you can imagine this, but if you're like me, you can't. And if you can't, then if that analysis appears implausible, outrageous, indeed offensive, then you have a defeater, an objection to the RT interpretation of Romans 1:18-20. And that brings me back to the reading of the passage that I proposed initially, to take this as part of a general sweeping indictment of humanity, which forms part of the sweep of Paul's overall argument in Romans 1-3, without insisting that we can necessarily say it applies to every putative instance of doubt or disbelief, whether that of the Christian or of the atheist. To sum up, we are simply not warranted in concluding, based on this sweeping argument in Romans 1-3, that every instance of a failure to affirm God's existence, power, or nature with maximal conviction is thereby sinful. If we cannot use this passage to impugn all theistic doubters, neither can we use it to impugn all atheistic disbelievers. Part 3, empirical evidence for RT. While Scripture provides the primary support for RT, at least it seems when I talk to people, this is most commonly their first place they go, Christians also appeal to empirical evidence to justify the claim. The basic method here proceeds as follows. One begins by identifying a putative instance of anti-theism, of people expressing hostility toward God. One then infers that this particular instance supports the general conclusion that all atheists are at their heart or their core anti-theists in accord with the expectations of RT. While I devote a chapter to discussing and rebutting empirical arguments like this in Is the Atheist My Neighbor, here I will limit my analysis to two decisive problems with this method. One, the problem of cherry-picking one's examples, and two, the problem of underdetermination. So let's start with the problem of cherry-picking examples. The problem here is that the defender of RT is selectively engaging the evidence, counting putative instances of anti-theism as indicative of a universal anti-theistic atheism, whilst discounting putative instances of non-anti-theistic atheism. In other words, the defender of RT is counting instances that support her thesis while discounting instances that do not. And there are many instances, many examples, where atheists who express no hostility toward God, where they believe theism and Christianity are intellectually respectable, some that even state they wish theism were true, but they nonetheless find themselves unpersuaded by the evidence or otherwise unable to believe. One of them was Jeffrey J. Lauder. He's a well-known atheist that I interview in my book in one of the chapters. And just last week, I engaged in a debate on a British radio program called Unbelievable, which is podcasted online if you're interested in hearing it. And I debated with a well-known atheist philosopher named Michael Ruse. Now, the only thing was, in this debate, we wanted to flip sides. So I defended atheism, and Michael Ruse defended Christianity. And we had a good time. The exercise, as you might guess, is a way of getting into the mindset of another person, understanding the arguments they hold for their position. Well, in my experience with Michael Ruse, I've always found him to be pleasant and amiable. He maintains affection for his Quaker Christian upbringing, and he considers Christianity to be an intellectually serious view of the world. He shows no evident hostility toward God. By counting the hits, Richard Dawkins, and discounting the misses, Michael Ruse, the defender of RT is engaged in a bald exercise of confirmation bias, one which may be no better than the xenophobe who justifies the claim that all Muslims are terrorists by proffering a selected list of Muslim terrorists. This brings me to the second problem of underdetermination. This term refers to cases where evidence is compatible with different interpretations and thus does not provide explicit support for one interpretation. And that's the problem. Many putative instances of anti-theism, which might otherwise provide evidence for RT, could be explained in ways that do not provide evidence for RT. Consider, for example, Smith, who describes himself as an atheist, and then he adds, in the manner of a popular Christian RT meme, "God doesn't exist, and I hate him." Did you get that? It's the paradox of anti-theistic atheism. God doesn't exist, and I hate him. Would this paradoxical utterance, this apparent expression of anti-theism, support RT? Well, it certainly could. For if atheists are, in fact, in rebellion against God, then we would reasonably expect them to express hostility of this kind toward God. But we must ask, are there other possible or even plausible explanations for Smith's apparent hostility toward God? The answer is yes, of course. For example, Smith's hostility could be explained in terms of transference. Imagine for a moment that Smith's father was an abusive, neglectful pastor, and that when Smith expresses his anti-theistic utterances, his anger toward God, really what he's doing is transferring his anger to his father onto his father's God. In short, Smith's antagonism may be, in fact, against his father rather than against God. If we don't know the genesis of an atheist's apparent antagonism, we're simply not warranted in concluding that it manifests evidential support for the anti-theism anticipated by RT. Well, that's hypothetical. Here's a real-world example. Author Barbara Ehrenreich, she's a well-known author, writer, journalist. She comes from a long line of atheists dating back to the mid-19th century. In her spiritual memoir, Living with a Wild God, She's still an atheist, by the way. Ehrenreich recounts how her ancestor, Mammy McLaughlin, first became an atheist, thereby laying the foundation for a family tradition. She writes, "When her father was dying, she sent for a priest, only to get word back many hours later that the priest would come for no less than $25. That's a lot of money in the 19th century, I must say. Perhaps the priest could be forgiven for dodging the long ride by horse or mule, but Mammy did not forgive him. From that day forward, Mammy counted herself an atheist with a significant degree of antipathy, which could be interpreted as broadly supportive of RT. But if those sentiments originated as a reaction to a money-grubbing priest derelict in his pastoral duties, then we are hardly justified in concluding that Mammy's hostility does in fact provide support for RT. And the challenge in every case of RT, of a putative case of it, is to discern the source of the hostility. Only if you can first do that can you say this in fact provides empirical evidence that corroborates RT. One final point. Imagine yourself as an atheist or an agnostic in the pew when John Hagee harangues atheists in his sermons. Or imagine you're in the audience of that student group when R.C. Sproul barks out that you hate God. How many atheists have become entrenched into their positions of hostility precisely because of Christians aggressively analyzing their beliefs by way of RT? Part 4, where do we go from here? Thus far, I've aimed to establish that many Christians hold to RT. Next, I've sought to provide a critique of the biblical and empirical evidence proffered in support of RT. The result is that RT, in my view, is unjustified, as it is supported neither by Scripture nor by empirical evidence. So now as we wrap this discussion up, what lessons should we draw? To begin with, it is worthwhile to highlight the link that RT draws between doubt and sin. As we have seen, according to RT, God's existence, power, and nature are readily evident to all, such that anyone who doubts any one of these claims is thereby sinfully denying God's clear revelation, akin to that person holding down the beach ball. The fact is, however, that doubt is widely censured in the Christian community. It's widely condemned. According to a recent Barna survey, 10% of Christian millennials in the church observed that in their church, quote, legitimate doubt is prohibited, unquote. But stigmatizing doubt is devastating to the health of a church. Indeed, it is akin to telling a clinically depressed person to just cheer up or keep quiet. It does nothing more than exacerbate the problem, alienating people from the wider community of support as they are forced to take legitimate questions underground to avoid further stigmatization. To put it another way, the healthy church is the church in which members are free to express and wrestle with honest doubts. Over the years, many Christians have shared their doubts with me privately as a professor, as if they were scandalous family secrets. In reply, I give them the following illustration. A twin otter bush plane crashed in the northern woods, leaving the pilot and passenger half buried in the snow. They've radioed for help, but it will be several hours before that help arrives. As they lie there in the stillness of the forest in the snow, the one man groans, "Every muscle in my body aches. I'm in so much pain." The second man replies, "Not me. Heck, I can't even feel my body." Of these two men, it is clearly the second one who is worse off. The man who can no longer feel his body has already succumbed to the ravages of frostbite and hypothermia. By contrast, the pains of the first man are the signs that he is still far better off. His body is alive. It's responding to its environment. Doubts are the same way. They provide the pains that show a faith which is still alive. As Frederick Buechner observed, whether your faith is that there is a God or that there is not a God. If you don't have any doubts, you are either kidding yourself or asleep. Doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving. Now, I don't want to say that you have to have doubts at the same time. I'll tell you, my dad had a religious experience 60 years ago, and he's never had a doubt. Some people are wired that way. What I simply want to do is remove the stigma for those who do doubt. But note, if we do remove that stigma of doubt for Christians, we need to remove it for atheists as well. This doesn't mean that there are no morally culpable instances of unbelief. I have not claimed that. There may be people who call white black even when they know better. But it does mean that merely identifying an instance of unbelief is not sufficient to identify an instance of moral culpability, of moral guilt. In other words, atheism does not entail anti-theism. This leads me to my second point. Since RT is not supported by the evidence, biblical or empirical, I must conclude that it constitutes a prejudice against atheists no less than the judgment that all Muslims are terrorists constitutes a prejudice against Muslims. And prejudices are deserving of social censure and, on the part of those who hold them, of repentance. On that score, Christians have a lot of work to do. So how should we proceed? Well, the answer, I think, is straightforward, if not simple. We need to rediscover the Christian virtue of hospitality, the extension of welcome to the outsider, the foreigner, the stranger. As an illustration of this simple yet profound discipline, let me tell you about the 2014 meeting between Catholic Pope Francis and Uruguayan President José Mujica. At first blush, the two would seem to be very different and to have little in common. After all, Francis is the vicar of Christ, the largest church on earth, while Mujica is an avowed atheist and a communist. But look closer. Mujica has been called the world's poorest president because of his decision to eschew the presidential palace of Uruguay in favor of his rundown house, where he lives with his three-legged dog. Every day, Mujica drives a 30-year-old Volkswagen Beetle to work as he strives to elevate the lot of the poor whilst laboring for a more just society. Oh yes, and he also donates 90% of his salary to charity. You may not agree with his politics, but it's pretty hard to doubt that his actions speak as loudly as any words. Now, as for his status as the world's poorest president, Mujica responds as follows. I've been called the world's poorest president, but I don't feel poor. Poor people are those who only try to keep an expensive lifestyle and always want more and more. So how'd that meeting go? Well, when Mujica and the Pope met at the Vatican, they embraced warmly, and Mujica delightedly referred to the smiling pontiff as a friendly neighbor. And with that, I always get emotional when I read this story. And with that, the ironic 1.5-hour discussion of two heads of state ensued. After the meeting, the Holy See issued a retrospective statement declaring the Pope is very pleased for having met with a wise man. Not a fool, a wise man. The lesson for us all is one that we must learn time and again. If you want to understand people, if you want to know the outsider, the foreigner, the stranger, set aside your presuppositions and prejudices and welcome them to the table of fellowship as a brother or sister or friend. Welcome the Christian, the Muslim, the Hindu, the Buddhist, the communist, the capitalist, the socialist, the secularist, the nationalist, the environmentalist, and welcome the atheist, who is your neighbor. Thank you.
Good evening. I am an atheist, and I would like to say thank you very much for your talk, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. Hadn't heard of it until now.
Great, thank you.
When you were talking about rebellion thesis, RT, right at the start, and you talked about the theologians who had discussed it and made these kind of basically hammer statements coming down against atheists, there really seems to be a perception from my side that there's a lack of empathy and an inability to step outside of yourself to entertain like atheist philosophy or alternative ideas about philosophy for people like that. And it also seems like people like that have a lot of sway in their community. What are your thoughts on that kind of lack of empathy and maybe that narrow-minded attitude that might be pervasive throughout that whole range of speakers and topics?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I began the book with a retelling of the parable of the Good Samaritan. But in the retelling of the Good Samaritan, like a pastor and a theologian drive by a person stranded on the side of the road, and the person who pulls over and helps is the atheist. And I think sometimes when we tell a story for a long time, like the Good Samaritan, we forget how offensive that was to the original people. A Good Samaritan was an oxymoron. It didn't make sense to Jews in the first century, for whom Samaritans were sort of despised heretics. So I think as a Christian, I think for those pastors and people, they need to resource their own tradition to go back and realize how destabilizing some of the narratives within the New Testament itself are, and to realize that how often, to take another example, let me back up. So the Psalm 14:1. So here we have people quoting to atheists that the atheist is the fool, when in fact this is talking about humanity generally, but in fact above all about people who verbally profess faith and yet don't live it out. That reminds me of another parable from Jesus, which is the parable of this fellow who wants to point out the sliver in his neighbor's eye and has a plank in his own. So I mean, time and again, I think when we rediscover within the Christian tradition, we've tamed the wild lion that some of these stories are in our community, and I think it's a tragedy. And for people like John Hagee, I mean, that deeply disturbs me. They're just whipping up tribalism and nativism within a church, when the very purpose of existence of the church, as it's been said, this is the only community, the only organization that exists for the sake of its non-members. And yet here we are firing at marginalizing the non-members. So it's a tragedy.
What were your two arguments against RT? One of them, I believe, was conviction.
Yeah, so RT is a truth claim. So when we talk about burden of proof, the person who wants to say every atheist is in rebellion, they have a high burden of proof. They have to provide some justification to believe that every atheist is really in rebellion, especially because at face value, at first blush, this appears to be a very counterintuitive claim, given that there are many atheists who seem to be such as I've described, that they don't have that kind of anger against God. They're not struggling with God. So the defender of RT has to provide the evidence. And what I'm doing is providing defeaters or objections to that evidence to show that they haven't met their evidential burden in order to justify their thesis. So I pointed out, first of all, they draw upon biblical texts, and I showed those texts don't actually support something as robust as RT. And then they appeal to empirical evidence. And I said, well, the empirical evidence, again, it doesn't support RT. You can interpret the empirical evidence in light of RT, and thus you can say that every atheist who doesn't appear to be hostile is really just suppressing it in a very clever way. But that begs the question of why do you believe that in the first place? And that brings us back to the justification for the claim.
Okay, but for your arguments against the biblical evidence, I believe you said one of them was conviction for Romans chapter 1.
So in that case, what I was doing is, this is a quick overview, right? But in this quick overview, I was saying, well, there are these two ways, and there's much more you could do with Romans 1, but at least there's two ways to be thinking about what Romans 1, 18 to 20 is doing. And what the defender of RT wants to say is that this applies to not just atheists, but including atheists. So every atheist who has any doubt is thereby suppressing that doubt, that knowledge of God, because it's clear and visible to all. And what I'm pointing out is if you take that interpretation, that rigorous interpretation, then it's a general principle which doesn't apply just to atheists, but to everyone, so that every person who ever has any doubt about God, any wavering in their belief or their conviction, is thereby denying the evidence of God, which is plain, clear to everyone. And to me, that's just a very implausible and unworkable claim, because I gave an example of Bob and Maria Giono. These are people who realized their daughter had been raped for 7 years. Of course they're going to have doubts about God's goodness and God's power and perhaps even God's existence. And it doesn't follow that when they have those doubts that they are morally culpable. But if you then say, okay, then we can't say they're morally culpable, you likewise have to concede that you can't say out of the gate that every atheist example of disbelief is morally culpable.
Thank you very much for that. So I'm very sympathetic to your project, especially sort of extending hospitality, which is probably something Christians should do, even if RT is true.
Sure.
But I mean, my question though is more about, I guess, thinking about holding a belief. Is it possible to hold? It seems to me. Do you think that holding a belief in God one way or the other is something that necessarily involves an existential commitment? So it seems to me that, for instance, believing in God or disbelieving in God is going to have some sort of existential dimension to it, as opposed to, say, my belief that there's a prime number that has 20 million digits or something. I don't really feel very committed to that one way or the other in the way that I live and move and have my being, however you think about this. So I guess if that is true, I guess I would wonder if, in a sense, that would qualify the rebellion thesis, so that, look, there are kinds of ways of existing that are going to be coupled with beliefs that are ultimately going to be either in rebellion against God or not. This doesn't say that the atheist is necessarily in rebellion. I think, for instance, that you might, for instance, think that, look, the sort of atheist who stops by in the sort of your retelling of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the atheist who stops is probably the one who's actually in the least amount of existential rebellion against God. Because the sort of priest and the theologian seem to be, by their actions, in this kind of existential rebellion. So we would say, look, their belief is actually something that's kind of contrary to God, if we think that belief has this necessary existential dimension. Does this make sense as a question/comment?
More as a comment, but I can certainly riff off of it.
But I'm just wondering I know I'm doing something I despise that other people do when they sort of frame things as a question, but it's really a comment. But
no, that's great, because then you can do whatever you want with it and reply, right? It gives me a lot of space to move.
Yeah. I'm just actually genuinely interested to hear what you think about that.
Well, so first of all, I agree that the question of God, as I understand God, and as I define God for the Christian, as this maximally good, loving, all-powerful, all-knowing being, that should be a matter of existential concern to anyone who thinks about it. Now, the reality is you do encounter people who are more than ambivalent. They don't care about it at all. Some years ago, Jonathan Rausch coined a term for these people, describing himself as well, that they are apatheists. So they are apathetic about theism. They don't care whether God exists or not. I am inclined to say people like that haven't thought hard enough about what it is we're talking about. I suspect they have a caricature of God, perhaps, in mind, the old man in the sky, rather than to understand God as the source of all being, goodness, the purpose of all things, and so on. So I want to think that it does, for anyone who properly thinks about it, it should have some sort of existential purchase on them. And all sorts of beliefs like that do. So it is not surprising that you will get a range of responses to the question of God from people. But one thing because what I just always want to do is then to say, but let's not try to paint this in the way like RT, so that we have the insiders who think rightly and the outsiders in the out-group that think poorly about this, because I think very often Christians or other theists can be in rebellion against various understandings or aspects of what they believe God to be and God's existential purchase on their life. So we should worry less about other people in other communities, more about our own communities and ourselves.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very provocative. I have a question and a comment. Do you think that Jesus, when he was on the cross and cried out in a state of dereliction, was doubting, not necessarily God's existence, because he seemed to talk to God, but was he at least doubting God's presence and current protection of him? Was he doubting?
I was teaching Christology this morning. We touched on that very discussion, because the whole question is, if you want to have a fully human Jesus without having a Jesus who is complicit in sin at all, then where does it become sinful or not? And can doubt, is doubt always have or fear as well, does that always have a moral dimension to it?
Well, the reason I ask is because you did use the example of the parents whose daughter was raped by someone whose authority they trusted. As a matter of fact, they thought that the authority had come from God. So if they can fall under your interpretation of Romans 1:18-20, could Jesus fall under that same interpretation?
Yeah, so that is the question. Could Jesus have had doubts? I think maybe to back up to a prior question, what was the nature of Jesus' cognitive life? I think often the evangelical background that I came from, we tended to veer toward a sort of cautious omniscience of Jesus, which sort of bordered on a docetism or Apollinarianism. I'm just throwing out terms at this point. But basically of saying, well, Jesus knew everything because of course he was God, but Jesus also gained in wisdom and knowledge and favor with God and men, Luke 2:40 and Luke 2:52. So he was growing. And I think he must have then, if he had a human psychology, he was gaining knowledge all the time. And if he was gaining knowledge, then he could have had mistaken beliefs. Say he could have had mistaken beliefs coming out of the culture of first century, the Jewish world of the first century. And maybe he then had doubts about some of his other beliefs. If his mom taught him something, he learned that it was wrong. He could have had doubts about that. Now, was he doubting on the cross in the cry of dereliction? I don't interpret that as a doubting. I sort of interpret that as part of, I think he's fulfilling this messianic psalm that he's drawing upon, and it expresses something of the nature of him taking sin on him. But it does raise that question of, could Jesus? I think Jesus could have doubted. So as I've said, but there are morally culpable doubts, and he didn't have those.
It seems to me it does present something of a prima facie problem for your interpretation of Romans 1:18-20. But now I have a comment. Believe it or not, that was just a question.
Yeah.
My comment is this. While you pointed out the caricatures on both sides of the RT position, is it possible in one's analysis to be caricaturing? Meaning this, that aren't there people who do believe RT sincerely, but they love their atheist neighbor and they treat him or her with respect, and therefore they might believe in their heart of hearts that this person really has a moral issue that's keeping him from God, but they don't treat him at every moment or every conversation, or maybe any moment or conversation, as though he really does have that problem.
Yeah.
And here's an analogy. You can go to a hospital, you know that somebody who's covered with an oxygen tent is there because this individual has smoked 3 packs a day all his life. You know what the truth is, but you would be hardly human, or a bit less, if you drew this to this person's attention. That person knows why he's there. You don't have to tell him. So while you may know what's wrong with someone, you treat them with love. And so this would be, it seems to me, a counterbalance to the caricatures that you're talking about. Because when I read someone like Craig or F.F. Bruce, other commentaries on Romans, would you concede that yours is at least a little eccentric?
What did I say that was eccentric?
They cover so generally, because they're the specific.
No, I don't think so. I think there are real problems with saying that the implication of Romans 1:18-20 is that to any person at any time, if they have any doubt, that is always evidence of a moral dimension, that they're rejecting evidence that is plain and clear to them. It seems to me that is not the case.
You can always tell the philosophers in the crowd.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a. I mean, there is. But let me go back to the other important point. So, it certainly is true, it's possible, and there are cases where a person can take this kind of view of atheism, and they could also be a loving, pastoral, very hospitable person. And so James Spiegel, I quoted from his book. I've heard him in interviews. He seems to be an amiable guy. He's not a John Hagee kind of person. He's not the R.C. Sproul. He's a very nice person. But I will say sort of that kind of analysis, nonetheless, is going to work at loggerheads with your attempt to build bridges with this community. But certainly you can be a generous kind of person and take that view, or a hospitable person.
A comment and a little question and a big question. The comment is, I really appreciate you referring to Jesus, because I think we really have to remind ourselves of how he interacted with people. And as we know, the people that he was brutal with were the people who thought they had it all figured out and they were living the way they should. And he just really hammered them. And the people who were clearly heretics and sinners, and everybody knew it, he was very gracious to. So we need to learn from that. A question about the logic of your argument at one point. You said we can't establish that somebody is hostile toward God or in rebellion of God if we don't know the origin of their expressed attitudes toward God. And I don't see that, because it seems to me somebody could really be hostile toward God even if the cause is something that happened in their past life. I don't see that entails that they aren't really hostile toward God. Okay. The bigger question is, the bigger issue is the nature of sin. See, when I read your presentation of the rebellion thesis, it's a little bit exaggerated at the end, I think, but in general, I want to say, yeah, that's true, but it's true of absolutely everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think, and even the way you put your arguments, it sounds like you're conceiving of sin as something that somebody's intentionally doing wrong, or something that they know that they should do X, but they're actually doing Y. And I don't think that's really, there's a lot of sin like that, but sin being missing the mark, just kind of being off from the way we ought to be, I guess I'm inclined to think that any kind of doubt or disbelief is not the way it should be, but we're all messed up and the world is messed up and it's the way it is, and that doesn't put me in a different category from the atheist at all. Yeah. I'm in that same boat, but I still want to acknowledge that, that's not the way it should be, and I'm not the way it should be.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I mean, if we want to talk, for example, I mentioned confirmation bias. So that's just one of a long list of cognitive biases that people have, and that we all have. We're all culpable of interpreting evidence in light of our assumptions, of engaging in motivated reasoning. Go on and on. And in that sense, we all stand culpable. My only concern is that we not draw a distinction between one group who are sort of doing this and then another group who are not. Rather, we need to recognize the extent to which we are all susceptible to interpret evidence in light of our own assumptions. And again, as I alluded to earlier, the Christian can be in rebellion, or another theist can be in rebellion against God and God's revelation to them as surely as anybody else.